The PLA intrusion process. Despite the variety of targets, Mandiant found that the initial access steps took the same form in almost all of the incidents it investigated. Phishing emails containing either a malicious attachment or hyperlink. To ensure recipients downloaded these attachments and followed these URLs, the perpetrator sent the emails from accounts created under the names of real employees at the company, like Surma at U.S. Steel. The PLA officers sending these messages also disguised the attachments with appropriate file names. For example, 2012 China-U.S. Aviation Symposium.zip, Employee Benefit and Overhead Adjustment Keys.zip, and North Korean Launch.zip, and in some cases changed the attachment icons and names, hiding the actual file extensions from the recipient. When downloaded, these files, such as the agenda.zip attachments sent out to U.S. Steel employees, established backdoors in the victim's systems that initiated outbound connections to command and control C2 servers operated by PLA officers. Command and control, or C2 servers, are computers used to remotely communicate with, control, and issue instructions to compromised machines by intruders. The indictment explains the multiple different functions of these connections to C2 servers. After creating a backdoor, the malware typically attempted to contact other computers controlled by the co-conspirators by sending them a short message known as a beacon. These beacons typically, 1, notified the co-conspirators of the successful penetration of a victim's computer, 2, provided some information about the victim's computer useful for future intrusion activity, and 3, solicited additional instructions from the co-conspirators. In its report, Mandiant dubbed these first 2 stages of PLA Unit 61398 intrusions initial compromise and establish foothold, corresponding to the initial installation of malware transmitted via phishing emails and the subsequent connection of the victim's computers to PLA-controlled C2 servers. Even within each of the 7 individual stages of compromise that Mandiant identified, there were sometimes multiple steps. For instance, establishing a foothold in a targeted system could require more than just one malware installation. The easiest kind of backdoor malware to deliver via phishing messages was a beachhead backdoor, which offered minimal functionality to the intruders. When downloaded, these beachhead backdoor programs would load a web page stored on one of the PLA's C2 servers and look for instructions contained in the HTML tags of that web page that it would know to interpret as commands rather than part of the website's actual content. Because it involves communicating with C2 servers via web pages, this type of malware is also referred to as a web C2 backdoor. The simplicity of these web C2 backdoors made them extremely difficult for the victims to notice or flag as malware. All they were doing, after all, was retrieving publicly available web pages, but this simplicity also restricted the range of ways they could be used. Constrained by the limited range of commands that could be input into a public web page's HTML code, Unit 61398 officers could only use Web C2 backdoors to perform very basic functions on the infected computers, such as opening a file or putting an infected machine to sleep for a specific period of time. In order to find and access the sensitive information they were after, the PLA often needed a wider set of capabilities, so they used the initial WebC2 backdoor to download yet another more full-featured backdoor on the infected machine. The real value of the WebC2 backdoor, delivered via phishing email, was enabling the installation of this second backdoor which could communicate with the C2 servers directly rather than through HTML tags on websites. In order to disguise these direct communications and avoid any detection tools, the Unit 61398 intruders communicated with compromised servers over the common HTTP protocol or other custom protocols designed to mimic legitimate applications like Google Calendar and MSN Messenger, so that the malicious traffic was indistinguishable from the other web traffic going into and out of the targeted company's network. These backdoors afforded the intruders a wide array of new capabilities to control and manipulate the compromised systems beyond what was possible with a basic WebC2 backdoor. Indeed, once a standard backdoor had been installed and was directly communicating with a PLA C2 server, there was very little that the PLA could not do to control the infected machines. Mandiant's report lists 16 things that Unit 61398 could do to infected computers, following the successful installation of a standard backdoor, ranging from creating, modifying, deleting, and executing programs, to uploading and downloading files, taking screenshots of the user's desktop, capturing the user's keystrokes and mouse movement, launching an interactive command shell, and harvesting passwords stored on the compromised machine. Of these various capabilities, the ones most central to the PLA's operations were those related to harvesting user account credentials and downloading or viewing sensitive files and messages. There is little evidence to indicate that Unit 61398 took advantage of the more aggressive or destructive capabilities on Mandiant's list, shutting down computers, for instance, or deleting directories. Rather, their intrusions were marked by efforts to change as little as possible that would be visible to the computer's users, so that they could remain unnoticed and undetected in the compromised systems for as long as possible. Having installed a full-featured backdoor and having made direct contact with the infected machines via C2 servers, the PLA's next steps focused largely on learning more about the systems they had compromised without alerting any of their victims to their presence. The third Unit 61398 intrusion phase identified by Mandiant, after the initial compromise and foothold stages, was privilege escalation. This involved collecting server information and user credentials so that the intruders could access as much of the compromised network as possible, instead of being limited to only the network segments and files accessible to the person who had fallen for their phishing message and installed their backdoor malware. For instance, after Sun Kai Liang launched the successful phishing campaign against U.S. Steel employees and installed malware on their machines, another PLA Unit 61398 officer named in the 2014 indictment, Wang Dong, alias Ugly Gorilla, managed to use those initial footholds planted by Sun to steal host names and descriptions for more than 1,700 computers across the company. That long list of server names and descriptions helped Wang identify the functions of the different computers at U.S. Steel. Some of the compromised machines were used for emergency response, others for network monitoring and security, and still others controlled physical access to the company's buildings, which, in turn, helped him figure out what machines might be vulnerable or useful and how best to compromise them. Escalating access privileges within compromised networks beyond the initial backdoors also involved PLA officers stealing users' passwords and login credentials. This, again, was a tactic aimed at broadening their ability to search and explore the compromised company network beyond a single compromised user or machine. The keystroke logging capabilities of the PLA's malware meant they could easily capture the passwords and usernames of the individuals who fell for their phishing emails, but that only granted the intruders access to the limited number of email accounts or company files accessible to those particular individuals. Since the Unit 61398 phishing campaigns were, on the whole, fairly tailored to their individual recipients, and sent out to only small groups of recipients to avoid or delay detection, they did not scale to the full employee population of large companies. Moreover, phishing intrusions are, by nature, effective only against the people who fall for them and download the attachments or click on the included links. So, just as the second phase of the PLA intrusions focused on broadening the capabilities afforded by the initial simple WebC2 backdoor to manipulate the individual compromised devices, the third phase focused on broadening the user credentials and access capabilities across the company, beyond the individual users and devices that had fallen prey to phishing schemes in the earlier stages. For instance, in another incident detailed in the 2014 indictment, a third PLA officer defendant, Wen Xin Yu, alias Win XY Happy, stole usernames and passwords for more than 7,000 employees of Pennsylvania-based specialty metals company Allegheny Technologies Incorporated, ATI. The credential theft occurred on April 13, 2012, the day after ATI held a board meeting to discuss a joint venture in Shanghai with a Chinese state-owned company. Most companies don't store user passwords in plain text on their servers, instead choosing to hash user passwords and generate a number associated with the password according to some mathematical algorithm. When users then enter their passwords, each entry is hashed according to the same algorithm, and if it matches the stored hash, the login is successful. So, what the PLA Unit 61398 officers such as Wen were usually stealing during the privilege escalation stage of their intrusions were lists of these scrambled or hashed passwords. But even so, they often found ways to make use of the hashes, either by cracking the hashing algorithm so they were able to extract plaintext passwords from the hashes, or by logging into accounts directly by using the hashes themselves to authenticate, a technique known as passing the hash. Following the privilege escalation phase, and having substantially broadened their ability to access different networks, segments, and accounts of the compromised computer system, PLA intruders progressed to internal reconnaissance, the fourth intrusion stage identified by Mandiant. Internal reconnaissance entailed gathering as much information as possible about the contents and architecture of the penetrated system. This information was typically obtained by running automated scripts on the compromised system that would list such things as the network's accounts, processes, programs, network connections, configuration settings, and administrators in a text file generated for the intruders. Having mapped out the victim's computer systems and acquired credentials to access every segment and server of the network, the Unit 61398 intruders then moved on to the fifth intrusion stage, lateral movement within the compromised system to find the information and files of greatest interest. Lateral movement in pursuit of high-value information was followed by a sixth intrusion stage, one uniquely essential to espionage-motivated incidents, as opposed to those perpetrated in pursuit of financial gain or revenge: maintaining a long-term presence within the victim's network. According to Mandiant's investigations of companies targeted by PLA Unit 61398, the intruders aimed to establish multiple means of entry in the computer systems they targeted. This way, Even if the victim discovered and mitigated the initial backdoor delivered via phishing email, the intruder still had other available means of access and exfiltration. Unit 61398 officers accomplished this by installing additional backdoor malware programs in different places on the compromised systems and using stolen credentials to log in through the target organization's own VPNs and web portals. These additional access pathways enabled Unit 61398 officers to conduct espionage campaigns over months or years. Across 91 of the different companies that Mandiant investigated and believed had been compromised by Unit 61398, the average period of compromise was 356 days, and the longest compromise lasted nearly 5 years. Hickton's investigation also uncovered evidence that Unit 61398's espionage campaigns could last a long time. The indictment alleges that Unit 61398 officers were conducting espionage on the computer systems of Westinghouse Electric Company for 2 years, from 2010 to 2012, stealing at least 1.4 gigabytes of data, equal to roughly 700,000 pages of email messages and attachments during that period. Further evidence also indicated that the defendants were not conducting one-time intrusions. For instance, in the months following Wen's theft of 7,000 ATI account credentials, ATI-owned computers continued to communicate with the same server that was used to steal those credentials, suggesting that Unit 61398 continued to issue instructions to ATI's computers remotely. The seventh and final stage of PLA Unit 61398 intrusions identified by Mandiant was simply completing the mission. This largely consisted of compressing information the intruders found valuable or interesting into smaller archive files, which ended with the extension .rar, splitting those files into smaller pieces so they wouldn't attract attention when they were exfiltrated out of the victim's network, and then transferring them back to the PLA via backdoors or common file transfer techniques, such as file transfer protocol. In a narrow technical sense, this exfiltration marked the completion of Unit 61398's mission. The desired data had been successfully stolen. But in a broader political and economic sense, this was presumably only the first step in some larger scheme of the Chinese government that the stolen information contributed to. Despite the considerable insight they offer into how the PLA stole sensitive and proprietary data, the 2005 indictment and the Mandiant report offer little detail about the ultimate use of the stolen information, making it difficult to analyze how defenders might mitigate the harm inflicted by these incidents, even after the exfiltration stage was completed successfully. The circumstances and timing of the intrusions strongly suggest that the PLA was attempting to help Chinese enterprises gain insight into their competitors' commercial strategies, international trade negotiations, and proprietary intellectual property belonging to foreign companies, and the indictment makes the most of these implications, even going so far as to claim that Chinese companies hired Unit 61398 to provide information about their foreign competitors. For instance, the indictment states, an Oregon producer of solar panel technology was rapidly losing its market share to Chinese competitors that were systematically pricing exports well below production costs. At the same time, members of the conspiracy stole cost and pricing information from the Oregon producer. And while a Pennsylvania nuclear power plant manufacturer was negotiating with a Chinese company over the construction and operation of 4 power plants in China, the conspirators stole, among other things, proprietary and confidential technical and design specifications for pipes, pipe supports, and pipe routing for those nuclear power plants that would enable any competitors looking to build a similar plant to save on research and development costs in the development of such designs. Yet, of the 31 crimes that the 5 Unit 61398 officers were charged with, only 2 actually relate to what they did with the information they stole. The rest are focused on how they stole information. The 2 counts that address the use of the stolen information, one for economic espionage, one for theft of trade secrets, are confined to the Westinghouse intrusion and the theft of one particular file, WD.RAR, that contained proprietary and confidential technical and design specifications owned by Westinghouse, which were related to the pipes, pipe supports, and pipe routing within the AP1000 nuclear power plant. The absence of detailed information about how the stolen information was used is not necessarily surprising. In espionage cases, it's often much easier for victims and the security firms and law enforcement officers they work with to determine how information was stolen than to trace what happened to it after it left their systems. But all the same, it is striking that so little seems to be known about how the intruders used the information they stole, since that usage is often how perpetrators are identified. When it comes to tracing financially motivated cybercrimes, for instance, it is much easier to wait and see who is receiving deliveries of large quantities of cash. For example, Albert Gonzalez and his co-conspirators in the 2005 TJX data breach, than it is to figure out who is controlling an overseas server housing stolen data. The theft of money using the stolen data not only helps investigators identify the responsible parties, it also provides a way to estimate the harm inflicted by a cybercrime. This amount of money was stolen, therefore this amount of damage was done. But the incidents detailed by Mandiant and the 2014 indictment offer no clear way to assess what harm, if any, was inflicted by the Unit 61398 intrusions, much less how to translate that harm into a dollar sum. Furthermore, both Mandiant and Hickton rely on circumstantial, if persuasive, forms of attribution based on clues, like who would likely have been interested in the stolen information, Chinese companies, and who was operating the infrastructure used by the intruders. Mandiant also inspected the malware programs used by the intruders to compile a list of grammatically incorrect phrases in the code that indicate they were written by non-native English speakers. Many of the code snippets they cite seem like relatively banal typos or errors. If use it, key is the key. File no exist. Doesn't started. Exception patched. But at least one of them reads as a fairly damning boast by Wang. No doubt to hack you. Righted by Ugly Gorilla. As with the DigiNotar compromise, intruders, even when they're trying to lay low for the purposes of long-term espionage, sometimes like to take credit for their handiwork. Intermediaries and opportunities for intervention. In the aftermath of financially motivated cybersecurity incidents, the question of who is to blame for failing to prevent the breaches is an urgent one, because it so immediately leads to the larger question of who will bear the burden of covering the financial losses. When it comes to espionage incidents, like the DigiNotar breach and the PLA Unit 61398 intrusions, however, the losses are much less clear, and therefore much more difficult to transfer to other parties via lawsuits or public pronouncements. For these reasons, the victims of espionage incidents are often satisfied to direct blame at the perpetrators, even though they have little hope of extracting financial compensation for their losses from adversaries like the Chinese military. This allows the victims to avoid the battles over what responsibility they may have had to protect the data that was stolen, as well as what role third-party intermediaries might have played in contributing to that protection. To some extent, this can be a good thing. It focuses blame where it most squarely belongs, and avoids the finger-pointing and squabbling over who was negligent and who was just unlucky. But viewed from another perspective, this focus on the perpetrators is profoundly unproductive. The way to try to prevent future espionage efforts like those perpetrated by Unit 61398 is to figure out who can better defend against those efforts and how, rather than trying to dissuade the perpetrators by symbolically indicting foreign spies who live safely within their own borders beyond the reach of the U.S. justice system. Unsurprisingly, the 5 PLA officers named in the 2014 indictment were never actually arrested. In fact, beyond simply not arresting the named officers, the Chinese government vehemently denied and denounced the charges, claiming they were based on deliberately fabricated facts and urging the U.S. to withdraw the indictment. China's statement referred to the 2014 indictment in quotation marks as an indictment, as if to suggest it was not quite real or legitimate. Responding to the indictment, Foreign Minister Qin Gang said unequivocally that China's government never engaged or participated in cyber theft of trade secrets. Gang further accused the United States of large-scale and organized cyber theft, as well as wiretapping and surveillance activities against foreign political leaders, companies, and individuals, alluding to the NSA documents leaked by Edward Snowden in 2013. Filing indictments against the spies employed by foreign governments did not appear to be a productive means of fostering greater international collaboration or less cyber espionage. In fact, China officially suspended the U.S.-China Cyber Working Group because of the indictment, or, as Gang referred to it, the indictment. Understanding the role that the Chinese government played in the espionage incidents described by Mandiant and the 2014 indictment, or that the Iranian government played in the DigiNotar compromise, is important for trying to assess who might have been affected by those particular breaches and how. But to actually draw useful lessons from these incidents that will help improve victims' ability to defend themselves in the future, the most important question is not, what did the Chinese or Iranian governments do, or might they have done, with the information they accessed? Rather, the crucial question is, what did the victims and intermediary parties do, or might they have done, to prevent or mitigate that access in the first place? Dealing with nation-state level espionage might seem like a more natural burden for the government, rather than individual companies to bear, but the PLA officer indictment showed that this was not a problem likely to be solved by the Justice Department. The crucial lessons of the DigiNotar compromise come from understanding the back and forth between certificate authorities and browsers, because that is the dynamic that will determine how easily similar such compromises can be exploited in the future. The crucial lessons of the PLA Unit 61398 espionage incidents lie not in blaming China, but in understanding the range of different organizations that Unit 61398 relied on to help perpetrate different components of these breaches, and the potential defensive capabilities each of those third parties possesses. As with financially motivated incidents, such as the TJX and SCDOR breaches, the most immediate and obvious place to lay the blame for successful espionage operations is on the direct victims, the companies who let their data be stolen, like U.S. Steel, Westinghouse, and ATI. In another parallel with TJX and SCDOR, the inclination when blaming these entities is to focus on the earliest and seemingly simplest of the errors they made: the poorly encrypted wireless network at a Marshall's store, the lack of two-factor authentication in the South Carolina government, the hapless employees who clicked on phishing emails and attachments at U.S. Steel. Certainly, the moment when those phishing emails arrived in employees' inboxes was an opportunity for defensive intervention, and the more people know about how to identify suspicious emails, the more likely they are to be able to cut off the intrusion at that early stage. But to believe espionage can be prevented solely by educating people about phishing is to severely misunderstand the complexity of these incidents and the technical design decisions that enable phishing. In many ways, the design of email facilitates impersonation and makes it difficult to definitively identify a message's sender. Anyone can send an email message from any email address on the planet and display any sender name they want alongside that address. Some, but not all, of these forged messages can be caught by filters, inbox restrictions, or symbols indicating whether the sender authenticated, i.e., logged into, the address they used. But ultimately, the ability to impersonate others is fundamentally built into email itself, and that can only be altered by major email providers and technical application designers. Rethinking how easy it is to send persuasive phishing emails is only one of a variety of different defensive interventions that could be used to interrupt the life cycle of the PLA Unit 61398 intrusions. These interventions range from the design of email and the treatment of attachments to the registration of domain names and regulation of outbound traffic to changes in international trade policy. And few, if any of them, are within the sole control of the companies directly targeted for espionage. As with financially motivated incidents, the most effective means of defending against espionage incidents is cutting off or restricting an absolutely essential bottleneck stage of the intrusion. For instance, the monetization stages of the TJX and SCDOR breaches. Though phishing emails were a recurring feature of PLA intrusions, they are not actually essential to conducting espionage, any more than they were essential for stealing data from the SCDOR. There are numerous other ways of gaining an initial foothold within a protected network, for instance, by guessing user passwords or distributing infected USB drives. The phishing stage of PLA intrusions was a useful one for espionage, but not an essential one. If phishing were no longer easy or effective, the intruders would have other means of accomplishing that same goal of downloading malware onto victims' machines. The essential stages of espionage incidents come later, making outbound connections to C2 servers through which the intruders can find and package useful information, and then the exfiltration of that information to servers they control. These are the stages intruders bent on espionage absolutely must carry out in order to achieve their ultimate aims. These are therefore also the intrusion stages that make for the most promising defensive bottlenecks, analogous to the monetization stages of financially motivated incidents. While organizations do have significant control over the outbound connections and flow of traffic from their networks, the use of stolen credentials makes it difficult to distinguish between legitimate and malicious activity, forcing defenders to rely on the volume and sensitivity of outbound traffic to identify espionage. Outbound connections to C2 servers controlled by foreign governments could offer some other clues. For instance, if the connections are made to servers in untrusted locations or on a suspiciously regular, unchanging schedule. But these clues, too, could be obscured by intruders. Unit 61398 officers whom the investigators ultimately trace back to networks in Shanghai, typically compromised third-party servers and used those servers to communicate with the targets of their espionage indirectly. This suggests yet another set of potential intermediary defenders, the owners and operators of the infected third-party servers that are used as platforms for espionage attacks. Companies that are the direct targets of espionage efforts usually implement defensive mechanisms aimed at detecting or interrupting the exfiltration of sensitive information from their systems. Third-party defenders, who are not directly targeted by the espionage efforts, may be less able to disrupt the information theft directly, but may in some cases have opportunities to go after the perpetrator's infrastructure and profits. For instance, the Mandiant report notes that PLA Unit 61398 has a vast infrastructure supporting its espionage efforts, which includes over 1,000 servers, several encryption certificates, hundreds of domain names registered by the intruders, and many more domains owned by compromised third parties. These domain names play a vital role in the group's espionage efforts, operating both as delivery vectors for initial backdoors via phishing emails and as embedded C2 server addresses in those backdoors. The report notes that by using domain names instead of specific IP addresses as the C2 addresses, the intruders may dynamically decide where to direct C2 directions from a given backdoor, so that if they lose control of a specific hot point IP address, they can point the C2, fully qualified domain name, address, to a different IP address and resume their control over victim backdoors. This system is similar in purpose to Bogachev's use of the DGA to ensure that he could easily resume control of the gauze-infected computers in the event that his C2 servers were shut down, but is somewhat less flexible than the gauze model because it relies on redirecting hard-coded domain names to new servers, rather than generating entirely new domain names each week, any of which could serve as a new C2 server address. The domain names registered by the PLA Unit 61398 could occasionally present opportunities for additional defensive intervention, especially when they were designed to imitate a trusted third party. For example, MicrosoftUpdateInfo.com, CNNDaily.com, and NYTimesNews.net. In September 2011, for instance, Yahoo took issue with one such domain, MyYahooNews.com, and filed a complaint against the person who had registered it with registrar GoDaddy.com using the name Zheng Youjun. The registrant did not respond to Yahoo's complaint, and the National Arbitration Forum subsequently ruled that the domain be transferred from its current owner to Yahoo, following an investigation that showed it was being used as a phishing web page in an effort to collect login credentials under false pretenses. Despite Yahoo's victory, trying to tear down Unit 61398's infrastructure domain name by domain name, or hot point by hot point, could never have been a feasible defensive strategy. It would have required the coordinated attention and action of far too many different actors, not just Yahoo, but all of the hundreds of organizations whose names and websites were being used in misleading ways by the PLA. Moreover, all of these infrastructural resources were easily replaceable at relatively low cost to the PLA. If one, or even a few hundred, domain names were seized from them, they could quickly register another 100. Similarly, if the compromised intermediary machines that Unit 61398 relied on to route their intrusions through were identified and wiped so that the PLA officers could no longer use them, It would only require the work of hours or days to compromise another set of serviceable intermediary nodes. In this regard, the opportunities for cooperation and collaboration between different third-party defenders stand in stark contrast to the ones suggested by the TJX and DigiNotar incidents. In those cases, third parties, such as payment processing networks and web browsers, had visibility into the harm being inflicted and an ability to control some of the most essential bottleneck stages of attacks, where perpetrators' options had drastically narrowed. Moreover, that visibility was concentrated in the hands of a relatively small group of actors with broad global reach, i.e., credit card companies and browser manufacturers, who could conceivably coordinate their defensive efforts. The PLA Unit 61398 strategy relies in part on the diversity and dispersion of potential defenders across their espionage infrastructure. These potential third-party defenders have, in general, less visibility into the espionage efforts than the actual targets, and can exercise control over only the most easily replaced resources and stages of those attacks. Yahoo shouldn't be blamed for the existence of misleading domain names that trade on the company's popular websites, or be required to monitor and file complaints against every such offending domain. But the extent to which the PLA Unit 61398 online espionage infrastructure is embedded in its adversaries' machines and brands makes it difficult to imagine any kind of effective defensive strategy that does not rely in some fashion on greater liability being assigned to intermediary actors, perhaps not the ones whose names are traded on, but rather those whose compromised computer systems served as crucial infrastructural stepping stones or hot points for Unit 61398. The PLA officers carrying out these espionage efforts knew that it would look suspicious to suddenly start channeling large quantities of data from U.S. companies directly to their own computers in Shanghai. So, instead, they compromised other machines at U.S.-based organizations, such as universities, that they could route their stolen data through. A government agency or U.S.-based tech company might well be in regular contact with researchers or students at those universities, and traffic between the two networks would therefore generate little suspicion if monitored. These compromised intermediary machines, many of which were located on college campuses across the U.S., were crucial to Unit 61398's success, especially since universities often take a less strict approach to network security than other organizations in order to foster collaboration and provide access to a regular stream of visitors and guests. The role of the compromised computers at universities and other intermediary organizations raises the question of whether those institutions bear any responsibility for the espionage incidents. The topic of intermediary liability is a sensitive one in the context of Internet policy, where it has been most thoroughly explored in the context of copyright protection. Websites like YouTube and Wikipedia, which primarily feature user-generated content, rely heavily on the intermediary liability protections enshrined in Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act. These protections guarantee that no online intermediary will be treated as a publisher of any copyright-infringing content that occurs on their platforms, so long as they do not post that content themselves and review and remove infringing content when alerted to it. As vitally important as these protections have been to fostering the development of new and innovative online services, the notion of intermediary liability takes on a slightly different cast in discussions of security. While protecting intermediaries from liability claims in the context of user-generated content may be beneficial for users and innovative content models, it is not so clearly advantageous to protect online intermediaries from bearing any liability for harmful outcomes that result from security breaches. Creating an online environment in which companies can reasonably be expected to successfully monitor and control outbound connections and traffic flows requires that they be able to count on those servers they connect to actually being controlled by the people and organizations who officially own and operate them. If those hot points have nothing at stake in protecting their own systems, if they bear no responsibility for the breaches perpetrated using their networks, it seems unlikely that they will go to great lengths to secure themselves, which, in turn, leaves everyone who communicates with them at greater risk. One alternative to holding intermediaries partially responsible for the role they play in espionage breaches is to focus on mitigating the harm posed by these breaches, rather than the technical pathways through which they are perpetrated. This is akin to focusing on interrupting the monetization of stolen data in financially motivated incidents. Its emphasis is on what happens after data is stolen, not how to prevent it from being stolen in the first place, but designing defenses to mitigate the harms imposed by cyber espionage, rather than the technical stages of the espionage itself, is tricky, given how many different ways stolen information can be used. The intruders themselves may not even know beforehand exactly what information they will turn up or how they will use it. So the safest strategy in defending against espionage is to assume that the exfiltration of sensitive data is itself a form of harm. Interrupting or defending against exfiltration necessitates assigning some blame and liability to the intermediary hot points that are so essential for carrying out that exfiltration. In some cases, particularly when espionage efforts are geared toward the theft of stolen intellectual property, there may be some means of trying to limit any resulting illicit profits through economic restrictions. For instance, in May 2013, a group of U.S. senators introduced the Deter Cyber Theft Act, aimed at fighting espionage efforts by blocking U.S. imports of products that benefited from stolen intellectual property. This was an attempt to target the monetization stage of the PLA Unit 61398 intrusions, assuming they were perpetrated for the purpose of economic espionage that would ultimately lead to Chinese companies manufacturing products developed using stolen U.S. intellectual property. Just as law enforcement officers targeted the monetization stages of the TJX and CryptoLocker incidents, so too the Deter Cyber Theft Act was intended to leverage policymakers' control over financial flows to disincentivize economic espionage by making it less profitable. Rather than going after the PLA officers who conducted the espionage, the bill's authors wanted to target directly the overseas companies who were profiting from it. Just as it didn't matter if Gonzalez stole millions of payment card numbers unless he was able to sell them, perhaps it wouldn't matter if China stole U.S. corporate secrets if there was no way for them to use that information to hurt the American economy. The Deter Cyber Theft Act tried to make defending against economic espionage a matter of protecting the nation's economy rather than its individual computer systems. The former task, if not necessarily easier, was certainly better suited to the particular powers of Congress. But policy-based measures along these lines are limited by the extent to which foreign companies conducting espionage require the economic support of international customers, and their effectiveness depends entirely on being able to reliably identify the perpetrators of espionage, a problem the Deter Cyber Theft Act sidestepped by delegating that function to the Director of National Intelligence. Cybersecurity incidents perpetrated for the purpose of espionage are much harder to defend against than those perpetrated for financial gain, because there are fewer opportunities to intervene outside the context of the targeted computer systems. Once the data is stolen, the harm is done. That cuts short the chain of events leading up to success from the perpetrator's point of view, removing the useful monetization stages that provide so much assistance during law enforcement investigations, and cutting out the large, centralized financial actors who have control over and visibility into anomalous financial flows. It also means the defensive opportunities are largely restricted to computer-based technical controls around exfiltration and outbound connections that are only effective if the third parties whom organizations connect to are not themselves compromised. Further complicating this picture is the ambiguity of the harm being imposed by these breaches and the uncertainty around whom they affect and how significant the related costs are. TJX, the South Carolina Department of Revenue, and DigiNotar were all victims of breaches, but they were, in some sense, intermediate victims. The real targets were TJX customers, South Carolina taxpayers, and Iranian Google users. The organizations targeted by Unit 61398, by contrast, like the victims of CryptoLocker, seem to bear most of the ill effects of the espionage efforts themselves, while compromised third-party hotpoints and impersonated domains serve as intermediate victims. Yet, unlike TJX, SCDOR, and DigiNotar, those third-party hotpoints and other intermediate victims who enabled Unit 61398's espionage efforts have largely avoided any liability. Part of what makes espionage incidents so difficult to defend against is this reluctance to engage with the question of what responsibility intermediaries play for enabling such breaches, and how they might be incentivized to do their part to prevent such compromises from recurring through their infrastructure. 7. Decades in the making. The Office of Personnel Management breach and political espionage. On May 27, 2014, the United States Office of Personnel Management, OPM, shut down almost all of its computer systems. During the outage, the agency created brand new user accounts for many of its employees, reset internet routers, removed software processes running on its machines, and instituted a requirement that administrators use a physical key card in addition to a password to authenticate to their computer accounts. Dubbed the Big Bang within the agency, the day was intended to serve as a massive reset of OPM's network, aimed at eliminating the presence of intruders who had been accessing the agency's computers since July 2012 and had recently begun delivering keylogging malware to workstations across the agency. But despite the extensive overhaul of OPM servers and accounts, the Big Bang ultimately failed to root out the malware and backdoor access pathways that those intruders had planted in the OPM network. In the months that followed the system reset, OPM would experience its most extensive and damaging security intrusions yet, culminating in the theft of personal information belonging to more than 20 million current and former federal employees. The OPM breach unfolded over the course of months and was only discovered with the assistance of several private security firms, highlighting the often fraught interactions between government agencies and private companies, the major obstacles government entities face in trying to upgrade and protect legacy technology, and broader industry concerns about the public sector's ability and willingness to take a leadership role on issues related to cybersecurity. On May 27, 2015, exactly 1 year after the Big Bang, OPM notified Congress that a major incident had occurred involving the exfiltration of background investigation data. The Big Bang, it turned out, marked the beginning, rather than the end, of OPM's security woes, imbuing the agency with a false sense of security right at the moment when its adversaries were ready to begin their espionage activity in earnest. The range and activity of data stolen from OPM was staggering, not just in its volume, but also its degree of personal detail. OPM is the agency responsible for recruiting and investigating U.S. government civilian employees, so it maintains extensive records on civil servants and their security clearances, as well as on applicants for government positions. In the 2015 breach, fingerprint data for 5.2 million people and background investigation information for 21.5 million current and former government employees were stolen, including responses to questions on the lengthy Standard Form 86, SF-86, used for security clearances. The SF-86 asks individuals not just for their own personal information, but also for that of their friends and family members. It includes the types of personal information stolen in other breaches, names, birth dates, social security numbers, credit card numbers, but it also covers a variety of other intimate details. During a Committee on Oversight and Government Reform hearing on the breach on June 16, 2015, Massachusetts Representative Stephen Lynch described the SF-86. This is a copy of the application. It is online if people want to look at it. It is 127 pages online, and we ask them everything. What kind of underwear they wear, what kind of toothpaste. I mean, it is a deep dive. And that is for a good reason, right? Because we want to know when people get security clearance that they are trustworthy. There is information here if you have ever been arrested. Your financial information is in here. There's a lot of information in this form. Most of this specialized information would be of little use to someone trying to commit identity theft or financial fraud, but the OPM breach, like the DigiNotar compromise and the PLA Unit 61398 espionage efforts, was not motivated by financial greed. Instead, government officials speculated, the OPM breach seemed to suggest that a foreign nation, likely China, was building a massive database of personal information about U.S. government employees. Such a database could aid the Chinese government in identifying undercover agents, blackmailing federal employees, guessing government officers' passwords, and impersonating those employees to perpetrate future insider attacks or phishing campaigns like those used by PLA Unit 61398. Unlike Unit 61398's efforts to compromise U.S.-based companies such as Westinghouse and U.S. Steel, however, the OPM breach appeared to be an example of espionage driven by political rather than economic motivations. This distinction was particularly poignant at the time because the U.S. government was itself fending off accusations of widespread espionage and surveillance activities following the discovery that U.S. intelligence officers had infiltrated the servers of Huawei, a major Chinese technology company. The incident was revealed in documents leaked by Edward Snowden and raised repeatedly by the Chinese government when the U.S. government attempted to condemn the actions of Unit 61398 through the indictment of PLA officers. In response to criticisms that its condemnation of Chinese espionage was hypocritical, the United States tried to distance itself from what Unit 61398 had done on the grounds that China was conducting economic espionage rather than the more generally accepted practice of political espionage. That made it harder for the U.S. government to blame China for the OPM breach, an act of clearly political espionage, and centered more of the focus on finding someone to blame within the U.S. government for failing to prevent the incident. In the OPM case, as in the case of the indictment charging officers of PLA Unit 61398, the Chinese government denied any wrongdoing or responsibility. China even later claimed to have arrested the individuals responsible for the OPM breach. In the wake of the OPM breach, Congress held several extended hearings on the incident, unraveling a series of ignored warnings from the Inspector General's office about OPM's inadequate security measures. As with all major breaches, the discovery of the OPM incident was followed by a lengthy and bitter struggle over who should bear primary responsibility for the target's security failings. OPM Director Catherine Archuleta resigned in July 2015. In February 2016, OPM Chief Information Officer Donna Seymour also resigned, 2 days before she was scheduled to testify about the breach before a House panel. But even with the departure of high-level OPM employees, there was relatively little to be done in the wake of the breach to protect the individuals whose information was stolen. There were no credit card numbers to cancel, no way to alter the victim's fingerprints, or take back the, often very personal, contents of the background checks that had been performed on employees needing security clearances. OPM offered credit monitoring services to the victims, and those services themselves quickly became the source of many fraudulent scams, with several websites and phone calls purporting to provide identity theft monitoring demanding further personal information from the victims. The ineptitude of the post-breach mitigation efforts highlighted the stark differences between financially motivated and espionage-driven breaches. Meanwhile, the government's inability to protect its own data in this incident fueled ongoing tensions between the public and private sectors about the role of government in regulating data security efforts, policymakers' ability to offer guidance and support to private companies, and regulatory agencies' efforts to hold negligent companies responsible for breaches. Deep Panda and the Attack of the Avengers. The extended timeline of the OPM breach and the numerous ignored warning signs leading up to its execution highlight how profoundly inept OPM's leadership was, despite specific government rules and security procedures. OPM was unable to make timely or sensible decisions about computer security, heed clear signs of threats and suspicious activity, and prioritize data protection measures that might in any way inconvenience users or invite criticism. The compromise of OPM's data occurred in roughly 3 stages, each of which consisted of several smaller steps on the part of the intruders. The first, pre-Big Bang phase, lasted from July 2012 through May 27, 2014, during which period the intruders planted their initial backdoors and stole reconnaissance materials about how the OPM networks were structured and operated. During the second exfiltration phase, from May 28, 2014 through April 23, 2015, the intruders stole large volumes of personal information from the OPM systems and a Department of the Interior, DOI, data center that was used to store government data. The third and final containment phase began on April 24, 2015, when OPM began to quarantine its infected systems and actively attempted to mitigate the breach, and lasted through February 22, 2016, when Seymour resigned, effectively concluding the congressional investigation. Computer security had been a major concern at OPM since long before even the earliest stages of this breach commenced. Government agencies regularly audit their information security practices to ensure they are in compliance with the Federal Information Security Management Act, FISMA, which lays out security requirements for protecting government data, such as continuous monitoring of networks, a system security plan, and an inventory of information systems. Michael Esser, the Assistant Inspector General for Audits at OPM, testified before the House of Representatives that FISMA audits had identified a severe control deficiency that prohibits the organization from protecting its data at OPM as far back as 2007, a conclusion reiterated in FISMA audits through 2013. OPM's repeated poor performance on FISMA audits and the agency's repeated refusal to take those audits seriously reflect not only how low a priority security was for OPM, but also the broader inclination of agencies across the government to disregard or pay only cursory attention to FISMA. The FISMA audits of OPM noted, among other failings, that the agency did not have an accurate, centralized inventory of all servers and databases that reside within the network, that many of its servers were never scanned to ensure they had been configured correctly, and that OPM had failed to meet the government's recommendations for implementing multi-factor authentication. Esser noted that some of the security failings were due to structural administrative issues. Each OPM program office had primary responsibility for managing its own IT systems. The program office personnel responsible for IT security frequently had no IT security background and were performing this function in addition to another full-time role. The agency had not clearly defined which elements of IT security were the responsibility of the program offices and which were the responsibility of the Office of the Chief Information Officer. As a result of this decentralized governance structure, many security controls went unimplemented and/or remained untested, and OPM routinely failed a variety of FISMA metrics year after year. Another problem Esser identified was the complete lack of consequences for departments that continued to operate computer systems after failing their FISMA security assessments. He testified that 11 of the 47 OPM IT systems did not have a valid security authorization, but continued to be used regardless, despite his office's recommendations to shut them down. In short, OPM had been paying minimal attention to computer security for years by the time HiKit malware, which allowed intruders to command infected machines remotely, began appearing on the agency's servers in July 2012. The following year, in May 2013, Archuleta was appointed OPM director with the express intent of modernizing the agency's computer networks and, in her own words, developing the important pillar of cybersecurity within our systems. Archuleta did not come from a security or even a technology background. She had previously served as National Political Director for Barack Obama's 2012 presidential campaign, and prior to that, as a lawyer and Chief of Staff at the Department of Transportation. So, to tackle the technical challenges of updating OPM's infrastructure, Archuleta hired Seymour as the agency's Chief Information Officer in December 2013. A career bureaucrat, Seymour came to OPM from the Department of Defense, where she had served as Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Office of Warrior Care Policy. But like Archuleta, she had spent part of her career at the Department of Transportation, where she served as CIO of the Maritime Administration. Seymour's official government biography highlighted the fact that in 2007, While she was at the Maritime Administration, she was named a top 100 Chief Information Officer by the magazine Computer World. Right around the time of Seymour's hiring in late 2013, the intruders who had already planted HiKit in OPM's systems began harvesting and exfiltrating login credentials for OPM contractors. In March 2014, the United States Computer Emergency Readiness Team, U.S. CERT, alerted OPM to the breach of its network, and subsequent investigation revealed that the intruders had accessed security documents, computer system manuals, and IT system architecture information. In June 2015, Seymour testified before Congress that the stolen files in the 2014 breach were outdated security documents about our systems and some manuals about our systems. After the 2015 breach of personal information, however, OPM IT security contractor Brendan Salisbury told Congress that the information stolen in 2014 would have provided intruders with more familiarity with how the systems are architected and might have included accounts, account names, or machine names or IP addresses which are relevant to these critical systems. From March through May 2014, Seymour and her team monitored the intruders on the OPM network, watching their movements but not actively interrupting any of their activities. But as the intruders became bolder, delivering new malware and keyloggers to systems belonging to OPM and its contractors, Seymour decided a more aggressive approach was warranted. On Tuesday, May 27, following extensive preparations over the 3-day Memorial Day weekend, she launched the Big Bang Initiative. Salisbury, who was involved in the pre-Big Bang monitoring efforts, told Congress, "We would sort of observe the attacker every day, or, every couple of days, get on the network and perform various commands. They might take some documentation, come back, and then access, somebody else's file share that might be a little bit closer or have more access into the system. And then it got to the point where we observed them load a keylogger onto a database administrator's workstation, or actually several database administrators' workstations. At that point, the decision was made that they are too close, and OPM needs to remove whatever they were aware of at the time." OPM felt sufficiently confident to do this type of monitoring of malicious activity on their networks for 2 months without actually taking any actions to remediate or prevent further intrusions. The agency apparently believed it was in control of the situation and was aware of everything that was happening on its systems. Rather bafflingly, as Seymour later indicated during her 2015 testimony, the agency seemed unconcerned about the loss of documentation about its own network's architecture and operations. The reconnaissance for the later 2015 breach happened with OPM watching and deliberately choosing not to interfere. OPM clearly felt it had a handle on the situation during the period from March 20, 2014, when U.S. CERT first alerted them to the intrusion, through the Big Bang event on May 27 of that year. But the intruders did at least 2 things during the pre-Big Bang monitoring period that OPM was not aware of at the time, and that laid the groundwork for the later larger breach. The first did not actually involve any access to the OPM network, but indicated that the intruders were making infrastructural investments to target OPM. On April 25, 2014, someone registered the domain opmsecurity.org using the name Steve Rogers, alter ego, comic book character Captain America, and the email address taprhpall@gmx.com. Less than 2 weeks later, on May 7, while Salisbury and his colleagues were still watching the intruders perform various commands on the network. An intruder logged into the OPM network remotely, using credentials belonging to an employee who performed background investigations for OPM through the contractor Keypoint Government Solutions. Using the Keypoint credentials, the intruder installed a malware program called Plug-X on OPM's systems, creating a backdoor into the network that would allow for continued access even after the Big Bang reset of accounts and elimination of the original HiKit malware. Plug-X allowed the intruders to capture users' keystrokes, modify and copy files, take screenshots and videos of user activity on the compromised machines, as well as log off and restart machines. The Plug-X malware also established an encrypted connection using fraudulent SSL certificates between the infected machines and the opmsecurity.org domain, so that the OPM hosts would beacon back to the domain at regular intervals for instructions. This beaconing allowed the intruders to regularly communicate with and control the infected OPM machines from the servers they controlled at the opmsecurity.org domain, while the SSL encryption made it more difficult for OPM to detect what information was being sent back and forth between their own network and the intruder's servers. It is possible that the intruder who installed Plug-X was in fact operating independently of the intruder who downloaded HiKit and stole the documentation prior to the Big Bang, which might explain why OPM, in monitoring the HiKit intruder they knew about, missed the new threat. The 2014 intruders were later identified as likely belonging to the Axiom group, while the 2015 breach was attributed to Deep Panda, a group that has also been named as the likely perpetrator of the 2015 theft of personal information belonging to more than 78 million people from health insurance company Anthem Incorporated. A congressional investigation later concluded that the Axiom and Deep Panda OPM intrusions were probably linked, based on how quickly the Deep Panda intruders were able to navigate the complicated OPM systems and access personnel records. A report on the investigation published by the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform concluded that the two groups probably shared a digital quartermaster. In particular, the report noted, the 2015 attackers' ability to gain access to personnel files and highly sensitive OPM data within just 45 days of their initial Plug-X installation suggests that they relied on information obtained by the 2014 hackers who had access to OPM's network for years and were unable to compromise the most sophisticated systems. The Big Bang left the Plug-X malware untouched, and in the following weeks, the intruders used the Plug-X backdoor to deliver additional malware to systems belonging to OPM and its contractors. By late June, as DHS was issuing a final incident report on the 2014 OPM documentation breach, the Deep Panda intruders had already begun connecting to servers containing background investigation data and compressing it into RAR files, i.e., archive files with the .rar extension, to transfer out of OPM's network. RAR files are a form of archive files that store data in compressed form so that the large volumes of data can be sent more easily. As in the case of the SCDOR breach, the RAR files allowed the intruders to exfiltrate stolen data more efficiently and potentially help them to evade any attempts by OPM to detect large amounts of outbound data. By July 2014, the intruders had begun exfiltrating background investigation data, and by late 2014, they'd managed to access the Department of the Interior Data Center, where OPM personnel records were stored, and had exfiltrated 4.2 million personnel records as dictated by instructions relayed from the opmsecurity.org domain. In addition to opmsecurity.org, on July 29, 2014, Deep Panda registered another domain, opm-learning.org, under the name Tony Stark, alias Iron Man, and the email address vrzunyjkmf@gmx.com, which was also used for data exfiltration. These OPM-related domain names, like the misleading domain names registered by PLA Unit 61398, were no doubt intended to look legitimate to anyone monitoring outbound connections from the OPM or DOI servers. But their registration information was easily viewable in publicly available domain registration databases. Had anyone bothered to look up this registration information, it would have served as a warning sign, both because it was obviously not owned by OPM, and because using Marvel comic book character names and gmx.com email addresses to register domains was a trademark of breaches perpetrated by Deep Panda. Their infrastructure for other intrusions included domains registered under the names Natasha Romanoff, Black Widow, James Rhodes, War Machine, John Nelson, the visual effects supervisor for the movie Iron Man, and Dubai Tycoon, the name of a character in the movie Iron Man. Buoyed by the supposed success of the Big Bang operation and their ongoing IT upgrades, OPM does not seem to have noticed any of the connections to these suspicious domains until April 14, 2015, nearly a year after the Big Bang, when OPM contractor Assurance Data noticed a suspicious SSL certificate on OPM's machines while deploying a new web traffic filter tool. This was the certificate that allowed the compromised OPM machines to recognize the opmsecurity.org servers as legitimate and to send and receive encrypted communications with those servers. Alerted to the domain by Assurance Data, OPM employees looked into opmsecurity.org the next day and deemed the domain sketchy at best in their response to Assurance Data after finding the clearly fraudulent registration details. But by then, the intruders had already registered a new command and control domain. In fact, the final use of opmsecurity.org came on March 9, 2015, more than a month before OPM was made aware of the domain. On March 3, the intruders had registered wdc-news-post.com, which they then used to exfiltrate the stolen fingerprint data later that month. OPM did not notice the new command and control server, but other warning signs, in addition to the suspicious connections to opm-security.org, began to emerge over the course of April 2015. Most notably, IT administrators discovered a suspicious file named mcutil.dll that was masquerading as a McAfee dynamic link library, despite the fact that OPM did not use any McAfee antivirus products. On April 17, 2015, OPM brought in security firm Cylance to deploy a monitoring tool called Cylance Protect in alert mode. The alert mode of Cylance Protect looked for any suspicious files, processes, or malware running on OPM's machines, but did not stop, delete, or interrupt that suspicious activity. When Cylance rolled out the service to 2,000 OPM servers, the alert function lit up like a Christmas tree, said Cylance Director of Incident Response and Forensics, Chris Coulter. Among other problems, Cylance Protect detected lingering variants of HiKit as well as the Plug X malware and several password-protected RAR files containing stolen data. Less than a week after deploying the Cylance Protect Alert mode, another security firm, SciTech Services, visited OPM to demonstrate their forensics and incidents response, Cypher, tool, and identified more malware running on the OPM networks during the sales pitch demonstration. At that point, OPM decided it was time to stop monitoring the malicious activity and take more active steps to end it. So, on Friday, April 24, 2015, the agency upgraded its Cylance Protect service to auto-quarantine mode, which meant that any agency computer flagged for suspicious activity or possible compromise would be immediately disconnected from the larger OPM network and shut down. That weekend, beginning Saturday at 9 a.m., OPM shut off power to most of its computers. In an email to his colleagues at Cylance on April 24, Coulter said of the shift to quarantine mode, "This is a desperate move. Tomorrow it is even more desperate by unplugging every device and moving over to new networks. They will blame any issues on the power outage." He also noted that some mission-critical services would be exempt from the quarantine, including the USA Jobs website and related applications, because they said if we bring that down, senators will come for us. Over the course of its deployment, Cylance Protect scanned over 10,250 devices at OPM and detected almost 2,000 pieces of malware. At the time of Cylance's quarantine operation, OPM still did not have a sense of the scope and size of the breach, but by early May, U.S. CERT had concluded that the intruders had likely stolen personnel records and personal information. Later that month, OPM's own investigation found that background investigation information had been stolen, forcing it to notify Congress and the Office of the Inspector General of the incident on May 27, 2015. On June 4, 2015, OPM announced the breach of 4.2 million personnel records, the initial exfiltration in late 2014, to the public. The full scope of just how much data had been stolen and how many people had been affected would not be realized until a month later on July 9, when OPM announced that, in fact, background investigation data for 21.5 million people had been accessed by the intruders. The next day, Archuleta resigned. Some months later, in September 2015, OPM would make another public announcement, this time confirming that 5.6 million sets of fingerprints had been stolen, rather than the initial estimate of 1.1 million. In February 2016, 2 days before a scheduled House hearing on the breach, Seymour resigned, and as a result, the Oversight Committee's final hearing was cancelled.